The desert at night does not announce itself. It does not demand attention or glow with spectacle. It simply exists, wide, patient, and quiet. Out here, far from cities and schedules, the Nevada desert settles into itself after sunset. The heat of the day loosens its grip, and the land exhales. Wind moves slowly across dry lake beds. Distant ridgelines soften into shadow. The sky stretches wide, dark, and uninterrupted, scattered with stars that feel older than memory. If you are awake at this hour, listening, it is likely because you are already familiar with this kind of quiet. The kind that doesn't rush to fill itself. The kind that leaves space for thoughts to wander, slow down, and eventually drift. Somewhere within this vast stillness lies a place that rarely appears on maps. A place whose name, for decades, was never officially spoken. Groom Lake, Area 51. A facility hidden not just by fences and warning signs, but by distance itself, by emptiness, by desert, by silence. And tonight, this story does not begin with flashing lights in the sky, or alarms, or revelations pulled from locked files. It begins with something much smaller, softer, more human. A voice, not a broadcast voice, not a voice trained for testimony or persuasion, but a tired voice, an older voice, one that has spent a lifetime choosing words carefully and sometimes choosing not to use them at all. According to accounts, this recording was never meant to be public. It was not part of an investigation, nor an expose, nor a confession in the dramatic sense. It was simply a reflection, a personal record, a final attempt to organize a lifetime of thoughts before letting them go. The man behind the voice is described as an engineer. That word alone carries a certain weight, precision, structure, logic. Someone trained to solve problems quietly, efficiently, without drawing attention. Someone who worked not in headlines, but in margins, in restricted spaces, under clearances and classifications, that shaped not just his work, but his life. Whether he was retiring, or ill, or simply aware that time was narrowing, remains unclear. Records suggest only that he had spent decades connected, directly or indirectly, to one of the most secretive facilities in modern history, and that near the end, he chose to speak, not to reveal secrets, but to reflect on the cost of holding them. In the recording, there are no schematics, no coordinates, no definitive claims about what lies beneath the desert or beyond the stars. What emerges instead is atmosphere, memory, a sense of long corridors and longer nights, of working while the rest of the world slept and sleeping while the world moved on. It is said that as he speaks, there are pauses, long ones, spaces where the tape captures nothing but breathing or the faint hum of a room. These silences are not edited out. They are left intact, as if the absence of words carries its own meaning. And perhaps it does. Because in places like Area 51, places defined by secrecy, what is never said often matters more than what is. Entire systems are built around omission, around compartmentalization, around the idea that knowing too much can be as dangerous as knowing nothing at all. This story, then, is not an investigation into what the engineer knew. It is not an attempt to decode his words or read between the lines in search of proof. Instead, it is a slow walk through the environment that shaped him, through the desert, the base, the culture, and the psychological landscape of a life lived in quiet restriction. Some believe that Area 51 exists because of what we found. Others believe it exists because of what we feared we might lose. During the Cold War, the skies themselves became a battlefield, one where visibility meant vulnerability. Facilities like Groom Lake were created not to hide answers, but to buy time, to test, to prepare, to remain unseen. Within that context, thousands of people passed through its gates over the decades. Engineers, pilots, technicians, analysts, most of them nameless to the public. Most of them trained not to ask unnecessary questions and not to volunteer unnecessary information. The engineer in this story was one of them. And yet, listening to his final reflections, what stands out is not secrecy, but weight. The slow accumulation of years spent working on things that could never be discussed at dinner tables, of achievements that could never be celebrated openly, of failures that could never be fully explained. There is a moment in the recording, according to those who have heard it, where he stops mid-sentence. Not because he forgets what he was saying, but because he seems to reconsider whether it needs to be said at all. Eventually, he continues, but in a different direction, toward memory rather than detail, toward feeling rather than fact. That choice is telling, because this story is not about uncovering classified material. It is about what secrecy does to time, to identity, to the way a person remembers their own life. Out in the desert, time behaves differently. Days blur, nights stretch. The same roads are driven again and again, past the same warning signs, the same stretches of nothing. For those who work within restricted ranges like the Nellis Air Force Range, the outside world can begin to feel distant, almost theoretical. Families learn not to ask questions. Children learn that certain topics simply don't come up. Friends learn that some jobs come with permanent ellipses. And slowly, quietly, a kind of internal silence takes shape. The engineer's voice, in its final moments, does not sound bitter. There is no anger, no urgency. If anything, there is a sense of calm acceptance, as if he understands that the story he lived will never be fully told, and that this, too, is part of its design. Declassified interview culture, when it exists at all, often strips experiences down to timelines and milestones. But this recording, by contrast, lingers. It wanders. It circles around moments rather than pinning them down. It allows uncertainty to remain unresolved. Perhaps that is why it feels suitable for the night. Because night is when certainty loosens its grip. When the mind becomes less interested in answers and more open to atmosphere. When listening becomes less about understanding and more about being present. As you listen now, there is nothing you are expected to conclude. No belief you are required to adopt. This is not a story that builds toward revelation. It is a story that settles, layer by layer, into quiet. The desert does not reveal its secrets easily. Neither do the people who spend their lives within it. But sometimes, in the stillness, fragments drift to the surface. Not as evidence, not as proof, but as echoes, a voice, a memory, a long pause. And in that pause, something human remains. The voice settles into the silence, and with it, the story drifts backward, toward the place where it all began. After the voice fades, what remains is land. Not the kind of land shaped by streets or borders, but land that stretches without interruption. Miles of it. The Nevada desert does not rush to define itself. It unfolds slowly, almost reluctantly, as if it has learned that being overlooked is its greatest strength. Here, the ground is pale and dry, cracked in places where ancient water once rested. Low mountain ranges rise and fall like frozen waves, their edges softened by time and distance. During the day, heat presses down and flattens the horizon. At night, The temperature slips away quietly, leaving behind a cool stillness that feels deliberate. This vast expanse is known officially as the Nevada Test and Training Range, NTTR. On paper, it is a military designation, a controlled airspace, a secured region used for testing and training. But those words feel inadequate when standing at its edge. Because what defines this place is not what happens here, but what doesn't. No towns. No roads that led anywhere by accident. No casual traffic passing through. The desert filters intention. If you are here, you meant to be. And if you are not supposed to be here, the land makes that very clear. Long before fences were erected, before warning signs and patrols, the desert itself served as the first layer of security. Empty terrain stretching for hundreds of miles creates a natural barrier more effective than walls. It discourages curiosity not through threat, but through indifference. There is simply nothing here, the landscape seems to say. Keep moving. This is not emptiness by coincidence. In the early 1950s, as the United States expanded its military and aerial testing capabilities, planners searched for places where experiments could unfold without interruption or observation. They needed airspace wide enough to lose things in, ground remote enough that mistakes could disappear into dust, a place where sound could travel without witnesses and lights in the sky could go unnoticed. The Nevada desert offered all of this without resistance. Groom Lake, a dry lake bed tucked within the range, became one of the most strategically valuable locations in the country. Flat, reflective, and naturally isolated, it allowed aircraft to land and take off with minimal preparation. Its surface, hardened by centuries of evaporation, required no runways at first, just clearance. But more than its physical qualities, Groom Lake offered something harder to quantify: silence. Silence from population centers. Silence from foreign eyes. Silence from the expectations that come with visibility. Geographic isolation doctrine, a concept refined during the Cold War, recognized that distance itself could function as defense. The farther a place was from civilian life, the easier it became to control narratives about it. In the desert, rumors fade quickly. Questions dissolve in heat and dust. For those who worked within the NTTR, this isolation shaped more than their commute. It shaped their thinking. Driving into the range meant watching the world thin out. Gas stations disappeared. Radio signals weakened. Familiar landmarks gave way to repetition. Same hills, same sky, same long stretches of road. The act of arriving became a ritual of separation. You were leaving one reality and entering another. And the land enforced this transition gently but firmly. There is something about prolonged exposure to emptiness that changes perception. Without visual clutter, the mind begins to slow. Without constant stimuli, attention turns inward. Time stretches. Thoughts linger longer than they might elsewhere. Infrastructure built in such an environment reflects this mindset. Buildings are low and utilitarian, designed to blend rather than stand out. Roads curve subtly, following terrain rather than cutting through it. Hangars sit quietly against the horizon, their size disguised by scale. Nothing here seeks attention. Even the fences, when they appear, feel understated. Chain-link boundaries, warning signs spaced just far enough apart to be noticed, but not shouted. The message is clear, but calm. This is not a place for wandering. Over time, the desert becomes more than a backdrop. It becomes a collaborator. Wind erases footprints within hours. Sand smooths disturbances. Tracks fade. Sound dissipates quickly in open space, swallowed by distance. Light behaves differently here, refracting off pale ground and vast sky, making objects appear farther away than they are. For engineers and planners, this reliability is invaluable. For those tasked with secrecy, it is comforting. But for the people who live and work here, day after day, year after year, the effect is subtler. Isolation begins to mirror itself internally. When your environment offers few reference points, you stop measuring progress by scenery. When every day looks similar, distinctions blur. Weeks pass unnoticed. Seasons arrive quietly. The desert teaches patience by necessity. Some who worked within the range have described a feeling of being suspended between the outside world and something undefined. Their lives divided cleanly into before and after the gate. Conversations learned to stay shallow. Personal histories became compartmentalized. And yet, there is a certain peace that comes with this detachment. The desert does not judge. It does not rush. It does not ask questions. It simply holds space. In that sense, the land itself becomes a participant in secrecy, not through concealment, but through accommodation. It absorbs activity without comment. It allows things to happen and then moves on. At night, this quality deepens. The sky over the NTTR darkens completely, free from city glow. Stars emerge in numbers that feel almost excessive, filling the blackness with quiet light. The Milky Way stretches overhead, unbroken, reminding anyone looking up how small their concerns truly are. In such moments, the idea of being watched, from satellites, from distant observers, can feel abstract. The scale of the universe overwhelms smaller fears. The desert humbles curiosity without extinguishing it. For those working beneath this sky, night shifts were common. Testing schedules often favored darkness. The desert at night offered cover not just from sight, but from attention. Planes could move. Systems could be activated. Mistakes could be corrected quietly, and the land would remember none of it. The engineer whose voice opened this story spent countless nights here, standing on this ground, breathing this air, watching this sky. In his reflections, he does not describe the desert as hostile, nor does he romanticize it. He speaks of it as constant, reliable, a presence that outlasts projects and people alike. When asked, later in life, what he remembered most vividly, he did not mention aircraft or facilities. He mentioned silence. The way it settled in after engines shut down. The way it pressed gently against the ears. The way it followed him home. Silence, in the desert, is not the absence of sound. It is a kind of balance. A neutral state that absorbs disruption and returns to stillness. This quality made the NTTR ideal for secrecy, but it also demanded something in return. Those who worked there learned to carry that silence with them, to become comfortable with unanswered questions, to accept that some things would never be acknowledged, even internally. Over time, the desert teaches restraint. You stop announcing yourself. You stop expecting feedback. You stop needing confirmation that what you are doing matters. The land does not reward effort with applause. It simply allows it. Perhaps this is why so many stories about Area 51 feel incomplete. Why accounts trail off. Why testimonies circle rather than land. The desert does not encourage conclusions. It encourages continuation. As night deepens, the range becomes nearly invisible. Roads fade. Structures flatten into shadow. Only occasional lights, small, distant, purposeful, suggest human presence at all. From far away, it would be easy to believe nothing happens here. And that belief, carefully cultivated by geography and time, is exactly what makes the desert so effective. As the desert fades into night, the story narrows toward fences, lights, and a name that was never meant to be spoken. Long before rumors gave it a name, before speculation filled the silence, the place existed first as a necessity. Not a mystery, at least not at the beginning. Not a secret born from curiosity about the unknown, but from a very human fear, one that settled deep into the collective consciousness of a post-war world. The fear of being seen, the fear of being watched, the fear of falling behind. In the years following World War II, the sky changed its meaning. What had once been a symbol of distance and freedom became a contested space. Aircraft no longer merely traveled through it. They observed from it. They measured. They photographed. They listened. And nations quickly understood that whoever controlled the sky would shape the future below it. During the early Cold War, visibility itself became a vulnerability. Satellites were still theoretical, but high-altitude aircraft were not. Long-range bombers, reconnaissance planes, and emerging surveillance technology meant that borders were no longer defined by land alone. Information could be gathered without crossing a single fence. And so, invisibility became a priority. The United States, like other global powers, began searching for ways to operate beyond the reach of prying eyes. Not just foreign adversaries, but the public itself. New aircraft would need to be tested, new materials developed, new concepts explored, and all of it would need to happen without confirmation, without acknowledgement, without explanation. This is where places like Groom Lake entered the picture. In 1955, operations quietly began at the dry lake bed deep within the Nevada desert. Officially, it was just another test site, one among many scattered across the vast Nevada test and training range. But unlike others, Groom Lake offered something rare, a natural concealment that aligned perfectly with emerging needs. The flat lake bed allowed experimental aircraft to land without traditional runways. The surrounding mountains shielded views from ground level, and the sheer remoteness ensured that even accidental discovery was unlikely. At the time, the urgency was not extraterrestrial. It was geopolitical. Cold War aerial reconnaissance demanded platforms that could fly higher, farther, and faster than anything before them. The U-2 spy plane program, overseen by the CIA, was among the first to benefit from this isolation. Designed to fly at altitudes unreachable by conventional interceptors, the U-2 needed to be tested somewhere it could remain unseen. And so it was. When test flights began, pilots ascended into skies that were not yet crowded with satellites or commercial air traffic. To observers on the ground, these aircraft appeared unfamiliar, small, high, silent. Reports of strange objects in the sky followed naturally. Unidentified did not mean alien. It meant unrecognized. But the public had no framework for understanding this new altitude, this new behavior. And official explanations were often vague, intentionally so. Weather balloons, experimental research, classified operations. The language of deflection was already forming. Secrecy, at this stage, was not about deception for its own sake. It was about containment. If adversaries learned too much, too soon, advantages could evaporate overnight. If the public demanded transparency, programs could be compromised before they matured. The solution was compartmentalization, splitting knowledge into fragments, each held by only those who needed it. This approach extended beyond technology. It became cultural. The CIA's oversight of black sites and special access programs created a parallel infrastructure, one that operated alongside traditional military command, but remained largely invisible. Decisions were made quietly. Budgets were obscured. Even within government, awareness was limited. Area 51, though unnamed at the time, fit perfectly into this framework. It was not meant to be permanent. Records suggest it was envisioned initially as temporary, a solution to a specific problem. But as technology evolved, so did the need for places where ideas could be tested without consequence. Every successful flight raised new questions. Every breakthrough demanded further experimentation. And with each advancement, the cost of exposure increased. The sky, once again, was changing. Radar systems improved. Surveillance expanded. Detection grew more precise. Staying hidden required not just distance, but innovation. Aircraft shapes changed. Materials shifted. Entire philosophies of design emerged, stealth not as an add-on, but as a foundation. And all of it needed space. Silence. Isolation. The desert provided these. Without protest. From the outside, it may seem paradoxical that so much effort was dedicated to remaining unseen. After all, power is often associated with display, with presence. But during the Cold War, restraint was strength. The ability to act without acknowledgement became a strategic advantage. Fear, in this context, was not panic. It was calculation. Fear of escalation. Fear of misinterpretation. Fear that visibility could provoke response. A single photograph, a single confirmation, could alter balance, could invite challenge. So secrecy became a reflex. Not aggressive. Defensive. The goal was not to dominate through mystery, but to protect through obscurity. To ensure that when something was revealed, it would be on controlled terms. And yet, as secrecy deepened, it took on a life of its own. The absence of information created space for imagination. Stories filled the gaps. Speculation bloomed where facts were withheld. The name Area 51 itself emerged later, drawn from maps and whispers rather than official statements. What had once been a practical solution slowly transformed into a symbol. But at its core, the site remained rooted in Cold War logic. It existed because the world had learned to watch itself. Because visibility had become dangerous. Because progress demanded discretion. Within this environment, people were required to adapt. Engineers, pilots, and technicians who came to Groom Lake entered a system designed to limit knowledge. Not out of mistrust, but out of necessity. Each person worked within a defined slice of the whole, often unaware of how their contribution fit into larger designs. Questions were not forbidden. They were simply unnecessary. This culture shaped behavior subtly. Over time, individuals learned to focus inward, to solve immediate problems without seeking broader context, to accept that some answers were intentionally unavailable. The engineer whose voice frames this story entered Area 51 under these conditions. He did not arrive seeking secrets. He arrived to work, and like many before him, he found that the environment itself discouraged curiosity beyond function. The desert did not explain itself. The base did not advertise its purpose. And the silence surrounding both made speculation feel irrelevant. It was easier, perhaps, to simply do the job. As years passed and technology evolved, the original motivations behind Groom Lake blurred. New programs replaced old ones. Aircraft gave way to systems. Systems gave way to concepts. Each generation inherited the infrastructure of secrecy, without necessarily inheriting its origin story. And so, for many, Area 51 became less about what was hidden and more about how hiding had become routine. From the outside, the lack of explanation suggested conspiracy. From the inside, it suggested efficiency. Two perspectives, separated by fences and distance. The desert, indifferent as ever, held both. As this place solidified its role within national defense, it also began shaping the people who passed through it. Working in invisibility requires discipline. It requires trust in structures that rarely justify themselves. It requires acceptance that recognition may never come. But it also offers clarity, a narrow focus, a sense of purpose defined not by applause, but by necessity. For the engineer, this clarity would last decades. And yet, near the end, as his voice softens in the recording, it becomes clear that even the most rational systems leave space for reflection. Why was all this built? What was protected? And at what cost? These questions are not answered directly. They are allowed to linger, much like the aircraft once allowed to disappear into the high desert sky. Once the site existed, it required people, and among them were engineers who learned to work without questions. He was not the kind of person anyone thought to interview. There were no photographs of him standing beside prototypes, no articles quoting his insights, no public lectures, no patents proudly displayed, no recorded panels where he explained the future. If his name appeared anywhere official, it was likely buried in documents few would ever read, attached to roles rather than recognition. And that was exactly how the system preferred it. The engineer moved through his days quietly. Predictably, he arrived early, often before the sun reached above the low ridges surrounding the range. He wore the same style of clothing for years, not out of habit alone, but because blending in was easier than standing out. He carried a badge that granted access to places most people never knew existed, yet he treated it with the same casual care as a house key. At home, neighbors knew him as polite, reserved, dependable. Someone who waved but did not linger. Someone whose job was technical, whose details were complicated, and whose explanations gently dissolved into generalities before curiosity could take hold. Over time, people learned not to ask. Inside the system, his identity was defined less by who he was and more by what he was clear to know. Compartmentalized clearance systems did not simply restrict access to information. They shaped perception itself. You learned early that curiosity beyond your assigned scope was unnecessary, sometimes unwelcome. Not because anyone said so directly, but because the structure made it obvious. You were given what you needed. Nothing more. Nothing less. This was not mistrust. It was efficiency. The engineer understood this instinctively. He was trained to focus on problems in front of him, not on the wider narrative. The culture of defense contracting reinforced this mindset. Deliverables mattered. Deadlines mattered. Performance mattered. Context was optional. In meetings, discussions were narrow by design. Technical language replaced speculation. Questions were framed carefully, answers even more so. There was an unspoken understanding that the fewer loose threads left behind, the better. Silence was not emptiness here. It was discipline. His routines reflected this discipline. He kept meticulous notes, but they were fragmented, never a complete picture in one place. He rarely spoke about work outside of work, not because he feared consequences, but because there was no habit of translation. Explaining would require simplifying, and simplifying would invite distortion. Better to leave things unsaid. Friends sometimes described him as distant, though not unkind. Present, but partially elsewhere. His attention could narrow intensely, then drift off without warning. Long stretches of quiet thinking punctuated by sudden clarity. These were the traits that made him valuable. The skunk works engineering philosophy, though he may never have called it that explicitly, shaped his professional instincts. Small teams, minimal bureaucracy, rapid iteration, and above all, discretion. Work quickly, quietly, and without expectation of praise. Success, in this environment, was measured by absence. If no one noticed, if nothing leaked, if nothing appeared in the news, the job had been done well. He built things under these conditions. Systems that would be tested, modified, and sometimes dismantled without ceremony. Designs that would never be displayed. Concepts that might exist only briefly before being replaced. Years of work could disappear into storage, or classification, or obsolescence. There would be no moment of public acknowledgement, no reveal, no explanation of what had been achieved or why it mattered. And over time, this shaped his sense of self. What does it mean to spend a lifetime creating things you can never claim? The engineer did not frame this as sacrifice. That word implies loss, and he did not see himself as deprived. He chose this work. He believed in its necessity. He understood its constraints. But privately, quietly, there was an accumulation. Achievements without witnesses. Failures without context. Long nights. Spent refining systems that would never be discussed. Each experience existed fully in the moment, then receded into memory without external validation. This does something to a person. Identity becomes internal. Purpose becomes solitary. You stop expecting the world to reflect your efforts back to you. You learn to find satisfaction in process rather than outcome. And yet, human beings are not built entirely for erasure. According to accounts, the engineer kept no journals meant to be read, but he did record fragments, technical notes, observations, reminders. And near the end, something shifted. The recording that anchors this story was not labeled as a statement. It was not framed as testimony. It was simply a recording, a way of speaking thoughts aloud without needing response. In it, he does not introduce himself. He does not establish credentials. He does not explain his importance. He speaks as if the listener already understands, or perhaps as if no listener exists at all. There is an intimacy in that assumption. His voice carries the cadence of someone unaccustomed to performance. Sentences wander slightly. Ideas return from different angles. He pauses often, not for emphasis, but to think. In one moment, he mentions routine, how the desert mornings always looked the same. In another, he reflects on how quickly decades passed once everything became familiar. He never names projects. He never confirms rumors. He never offers the kind of information people imagine such a person must hold. Instead, he speaks about boundaries. About learning where his work ended and the unknown began. About resisting the urge to connect dots that were never meant to be connected. About trust, not in institutions, necessarily, but in process. In structure. Non-disclosure agreements, in this context, were not experienced as threats. They were simply part of the environment. Like fences. Like locked doors. Like the desert itself. You learn where not to go, and you adjust it. Your path accordingly. Over time, this becomes second nature. The engineer did not feel silenced. He felt oriented. And that may be why, when he finally chose to speak freely, his words did not rush outward. They turned inward instead. The last words, if they can be called that, were not meant to inform. They were meant to settle something internal, to arrange memories in a way that felt coherent before letting them rest. There is a moment in the recording where he laughs softly, not at a joke, but at an irony he never explains. Perhaps at the idea that after a lifetime of silence, his voice might outlast him. Or perhaps at the realization that even now, he was choosing what not to say. He does not frame himself as a keeper of secrets. He frames himself as a participant in systems larger than himself. Necessary systems. Imperfect systems. He acknowledges uncertainty, not about facts, but about meaning. About whether the work achieved what it was meant to achieve. About whether invisibility truly protected what it sought to preserve. These reflections remain unresolved. What stands out most is restraint. Even in a private moment, even near the end, he does not cross certain internal lines. Decades of discipline do not dissolve easily. The habits of silence are deeply embedded. And perhaps that is the quiet truth of this figure. Not that he knew something extraordinary, but that he lived an ordinary life under extraordinary constraints, and adapted so completely that the constraints became part of him. To understand this man, the voice suggests, you first have to understand the machines. The engineer rarely spoke about machines as objects. In the recording, when he refers to them at all, he does so indirectly, as shapes, as movements, as problems that needed solving rather than creations meant to be admired. He does not describe them with pride or awe. He describes them the way one might describe weather, something complex, powerful, and not entirely controllable. Machines, in his world, were not designed to be looked at. They were designed to pass through space unnoticed. During the years he worked within the desert, experimental aircraft came and went with quiet regularity. Some existed only briefly, tested, modified, then dismantled. Others evolved slowly, shedding parts of their original form as understanding deepened. Very few ever reached public awareness, and those that did often appeared years, even decades, after their first flights. By the time the world saw them, they were already ghosts of earlier ideas. The A-12 Oxcart was one such machine. Officially acknowledged long after its retirement, it was designed with a singular purpose: to fly so high and so fast that interception became irrelevant. Its shape was dictated not by aesthetics, but by physics. Angled surfaces, long, narrow lines. An aircraft that looked unfamiliar because it was answering questions no one outside the program had been allowed to ask yet. To observers on the ground, however, context was missing. People saw flashes of metal at impossible altitudes, reflections that moved too quickly, objects that did not behave like conventional aircraft. In an era before widespread knowledge of high-altitude reconnaissance, imagination stepped in to fill the gap. Stories followed. Later, the State Route 71 Blackbird would become one of the most iconic aircraft ever revealed, its sleek form celebrated in museums and documentaries. But during its development, it was simply another problem to be solved. How to manage heat at extreme speeds. How to reduce visibility. How to design propulsion systems that operated at the edge of known capability. Engineers like the one in this story approached these challenges quietly. Their conversations were technical, but their understanding was intuitive. They thought in terms of trade-offs rather than triumphs. Every gain in speed meant a loss elsewhere. Every attempt at concealment introduced new complications. Radar cross-section. Research, for example, was not about making something invisible. It was about making it confusing, breaking up returns, altering profiles. ensuring that what appeared on screens did not resolve cleanly into recognizable forms. To radar operators, this meant anomalies. To pilots, it meant uncertainty. To civilians who glimpsed something overhead, it meant questions. And questions, when unanswered, tend to drift. The engineer understood this dynamic. He did not dismiss speculation outright. In the recording, there is a moment where he acknowledges that if he had seen what others saw, without explanation, he might have drawn similar conclusions. Because perception rarely waits for confirmation. A shape in the sky is never just a shape. It is interpreted through expectation, experience, and fear. During the Cold War, when nuclear tension lingered beneath daily life, the unknown carried additional weight. An unfamiliar aircraft was not merely strange, it was potentially threatening. But secrecy did not allow for clarification. Black project testing protocols ensured that information remained tightly controlled. Flight paths were restricted. Schedules were adjusted to minimize exposure. When sightings occurred, they were neither confirmed nor denied. Silence was often the safest response. This silence, however, had consequences. Without official explanations, stories multiplied. Each retelling added detail, certainty, and emotion. What began as misidentification hardened into belief. What was once ambiguous became intentional in the imagination. The engineer did not seem troubled by this. In fact, he appeared to accept it as inevitable. In one section of the recording, he reflects on how machines designed to remain unseen paradoxically become the most talked about. The act of hiding, he suggests, draws attention not because people sense deception, but because absence invites invention. Secrecy breeds stories, not clarity. He speaks of nights when test flights concluded, and silence returned to the desert. Engines shut down, lights dimmed, the sky emptied. And yet, somewhere beyond the range, someone would later recount seeing something impossible. A craft that moved without sound. A light that changed direction too quickly. A silhouette that did not match anything known. None of these accounts were entirely false. They were simply incomplete. And completeness, in this environment, was never an option. The machines themselves were indifferent to how they were perceived. They followed physics. They responded to input. They succeeded or failed quietly. But the humans who encountered them, briefly, unexpectedly, carried those moments with them. For the engineer, this awareness created distance. He stopped thinking about public perception entirely. It was not part of the design process. His responsibility was to function within constraints, not to manage narratives. Others handled that. Instead, he focused on refinement, on reducing signatures, on minimizing traces. Yet even the most carefully designed machine leaves something behind. Heat in the air, sound that travels farther than intended, a visual distortion against the sky, and beyond that, memory. He recalls, in the recording, standing outside during a pause in testing, looking up at an empty sky and realizing that the absence itself would soon be interpreted. That nothing happening could be as suggestive as something happening. This realization did not concern him. It intrigued him, because it underscored something fundamental. Technology does not exist in isolation. It exists in relationship, with observers, with expectations, with imagination. And in a place like Area 51, where official acknowledgement was deliberately withheld, that relationship skewed toward myth. The engineer never corrects these myths, not because he endorses them, but because he understands their function. They absorb attention. They redirect curiosity. They protect the mundane reality of classified. work by wrapping it in something more fantastical. Aliens, in this sense, were not the point. They were a byproduct. The real focus remained terrestrial. Human, political, technological. Machines were built not to explore the unknown, but to manage risk, to gather information without being gathered in return, to maintain advantage without escalation. Yet, to those who glimpsed them, the effect was the same: wonder, confusion, unease. The engineer acknowledges this quietly. He speaks of the irony that some of the most advanced machines ever created were misunderstood precisely because they worked as intended. They were never supposed to be seen, but they were seen anyway. And in those fleeting moments of observation, entire belief systems began to form, not from evidence, but from absence, from the lack of explanation, from the refusal to clarify. As he reflects on this, there is no regret in his voice, only distance. He had long since accepted that the machines would outlive their purposes in stories rather than in service, that their shapes would be remembered not for what they did, but for what people imagined they did. This, too, was part of the system, because every machine leaves a trace, not in the sky, but in the people who built them. Secrecy, in places like this, is not enforced the way outsiders imagine. There are fences, of course, gates, guards, cameras that never seem to blink. But those are only the outermost edges, the visible geometry of control. They exist to mark a boundary, not to define the system itself. The real structure is quieter, more subtle, and far more effective. The engineer describes it not as a wall, but as a layering, like sediment, built slowly, deliberately, until moving through it feels natural, almost invisible. When he first arrived, he expected secrecy to feel restrictive, heavy. He imagined locked doors and stern warnings. What he encountered instead was something gentler, but more disorienting. Badges, different. Colors, different markings, different permissions that revealed themselves not through explanation, but through absence. A door that opened for one person and not another. A hallway that quietly narrowed access. A meeting invitation that never arrived. No one announced these limits. They didn't need to. You learned by moving through space. A badge was not just an identifier. It was a map of what you were allowed to know, and more importantly, what you were expected not to ask about. Each color, each code, each embedded clearance level carried an unspoken instruction. This is where your curiosity stops. Special access programs, SAPs, form the inner skeleton of this architecture. Their existence was acknowledged only to those already inside them. For everyone else, they were hinted at indirectly, through gaps, through projects that began and ended without explanation, through equipment that arrived already sealed, already classified beyond conversation. The engineer learned quickly that ignorance was not a failure here. It was a qualification. The compartmentalization doctrine ensured that no single person held a complete picture. Even senior staff often operated with partial context. This was not a sign of mistrust in individuals, but a strategy against vulnerability. Information, when distributed narrowly, could not easily leak, because it could not easily be assembled. Knowing less reduced risk. And over time, it reshaped how people thought. Conversations became precise. Language narrowed. Questions were framed carefully, or not at all. You learned to speak in function rather than implication. To focus on inputs and outputs, not origins or destinations. The engineer recalls moments when he realized, suddenly, that a colleague beside him was working on something adjacent but inaccessible. A shared problem, split cleanly down the middle, each of them holding one side, neither permitted to see the other. This separation did not create tension. It created calm, because the system was consistent. Once you accepted its logic, you stopped resisting it. The need-to-know principle became not just a rule, but a relief. You were no longer responsible for understanding everything, only for doing your part well. Responsibility narrowed. Anxiety softened. Secrecy, then, was not experienced as pressure. It was experienced as atmosphere. Like air, it was everywhere, shaping movement without drawing attention to itself. The engineer describes walking through facilities where nothing appeared labeled in any meaningful way. Rooms with generic names. Equipment identified only by numbers. Files stripped of narrative. Everything reduced to function. This reduction was intentional. Meaning creates attachment. Attachment invites curiosity. Curiosity leads outward. Here, inward focus was prized. Even the architecture reflected this philosophy. Buildings were modular. Interiors adaptable. Walls that could be reconfigured. Nothing permanent. Nothing personal. You did not decorate your workspace. You did not leave traces of identity. Personal items were minimal. Not forbidden, just unnecessary. Over time, the environment taught you how to behave. You stopped filling silence with speculation. You stopped drawing conclusions from incomplete data. You learned to let unanswered questions rest. And something else happened, slowly. You stopped noticing what you didn't know. The engineer admits this realization came late. That one day, after years of work, he recognized how naturally he avoided certain lines of thought. How reflexively his mind redirected itself away from forbidden edges. Not because of fear, but because of habit. The architecture had done its work. Pentagon black budget structures supported this environment quietly, invisibly. Funds moved without public accounting. Programs existed without names. Outcomes were measured internally, shielded from external scrutiny. This financial opacity was not sinister to those inside it. It was simply another layer. One that ensured continuity without interruption. Debate requires visibility. Visibility invites challenge. Challenge slows progress. Here, progress moved without noise. The engineer does not frame this as manipulation. He frames it as design. Secrecy, in his experience, was not a command. It was a condition. Like gravity, you worked within it, adjusted to it, and eventually forgot it could be otherwise. This had consequences. Without a broader picture, time began to behave differently. Projects blurred together. Milestones lost their public markers. There were no announcements, no celebrations. Completion felt quiet, almost anticlimactic. Years passed measured only by internal revisions and subtle shifts in responsibility. The engineer notes that he often forgot how long he had been working on something until paperwork forced a date into view. 5 years. 10. More. The absence of external reference points compressed memory. This compression created a strange intimacy with the present moment. You focused on what was directly in front of you. The rest faded. Secrecy, in this sense, was not just about hiding information. It was about shaping attention. What you looked at, what you ignored, what you learned to consider irrelevant. The engineer speaks carefully here. He does not condemn this system, nor does he praise it. He simply observes its effect, how it simplified life while complicating meaning, how it protected work while isolating the worker, how it created safety at the cost of context. He describes moments of almost forgetting that an outside world existed, moments when the rhythms of the range felt complete, self-contained. And then, sudden reminders. A holiday. A news headline. A family gathering where conversations felt strangely loud, strangely unstructured. Reentry was always disorienting. The outside world spoke freely, speculated openly, assumed access to information that, inside the range, would have been unthinkable. The engineer did not correct them. He did not feel the need to. Their freedom felt fragile. His silence felt necessary. In the recording, there is a pause here. A long one, as if he is considering whether this environment took more than it gave. He never answers. Instead, he returns to description, to routine, to how secrecy became so embedded that it no longer required enforcement. People enforced it within themselves, not out of fear, but out of alignment. That alignment is perhaps the most remarkable part of the architecture. Secrecy worked because it was normalized, because it was quiet, because it asked very little and shaped everything. Inside this environment, time begins to behave differently. Time does not move through places like this the way it does everywhere else. Inside restricted facilities, clocks still tick, calendars still turn, and schedules are still followed, but the feeling of time changes. It softens. It stretches. It loses its edges. Days become less distinct from one another, and nights begin to feel longer than they should. The engineer noticed this early, though he couldn't have explained it at first. His work rarely followed a traditional rhythm. Shift-based defense work demanded flexibility, and flexibility gradually replaced normalcy. One week he would arrive before dawn, the desert still holding the last of the night's cold. Another week, he would begin as the sun slipped behind the mountains, the sky deepening into indigo while the world outside prepared for sleep. Night shifts were common, preferred, even. Testing schedules often favored darkness. Fewer eyes in the sky, less ambient interference, more control. Inside the facilities, artificial lighting erased any clear distinction between day and night. Fluorescent light hummed softly overhead, constant and unwavering. There were no windows in most workspaces, no visual cues to mark the passage of hours. Time became something you measured by tasks, not by light. The engineer learned to move within this environment without resistance. He adjusted his sleep without complaint, learned how much rest he truly needed, learned how to nap briefly, efficiently, when schedules allowed, learned how to remain alert at 3 in the morning when most of the world was dreaming. Circadian rhythm disruption was not discussed openly, but it was understood. Bodies adapted, even if minds lagged behind. Coffee became ritual. Quiet conversations filled the gaps between long stretches of focus. People spoke softly at night, not out of courtesy, but because loudness felt unnecessary in a space already so controlled. There was a calm to it. The night shift carried its own atmosphere, slower, quieter, less interrupted. Fewer supervisors, fewer meetings, more time to think. Engineers often preferred it for that reason alone. The absence of daytime bustle created room for concentration and for something else more subtle. Reflection. Repetition played a role here. The same corridors, the same security checkpoints, the same routines performed night after night. Badge scanned, door opened, equipment checked, notes reviewed, systems monitored. At first, repetition feels grounding, predictable, safe. Over time, it becomes something else. The engineer describes how weeks would pass without leaving a strong impression. Months blended together. Entire seasons went unnoticed. He would realize it was winter only when the air outside the facility felt sharper, or summer only when the heat lingered longer after sunset. Inside, nothing changed. Secure facility schedules prioritized consistency over variety. Lighting remained constant. Temperature controlled. Noise minimized. Every effort was made to eliminate variables. This stability was essential for testing, but it also insulated workers from natural cycles. The result was a sense of suspension. Life inside the range felt paused, even as years accumulated quietly. The engineer recalls moments when he struggled to place memories in time. He could remember what happened, but not when. Events lost their chronological anchors. A breakthrough might feel recent even if it occurred a decade earlier. A setback might linger emotionally long after its relevance faded. Occupational psychology studies describe this phenomenon as temporal compression, when repetitive environments reduce the brain's ability to differentiate experiences. The mind conserves energy by grouping similar days together. What remains are only the outliers. But in a place designed to minimize outliers, memory itself becomes flattened. This did not trouble the engineer. Not at first. He found comfort in routine. The predictability allowed him to focus fully on his work. Each night unfolded like the one before it. There was no need to anticipate surprise. Nothing demanded emotional urgency. The world outside felt louder by comparison. Messier, less precise. During breaks, he would step outside occasionally, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness. The desert at night was vast and silent, the stars sharp against the sky. These moments were brief, but grounding. A reminder that something larger still existed beyond schedules and systems. Then he would return inside, back into the controlled glow. Over the years, this rhythm became his baseline. Friends noticed he spoke less about time, no longer marking events by dates, but by projects. He might say something happened during that phase, or before that system was updated, rather than 5 years ago. His internal calendar reorganized itself around work. This narrowing of focus had consequences beyond the facility. Holidays felt strange. Days off felt unearned. Long stretches away from the range created unease rather than relief. Without routine, time expanded uncomfortably. Decisions felt heavier. Silence felt louder. The engineer learned that the structure he worked within had also structured him. Night shifts, in particular, encouraged a certain inwardness. Conversations were fewer. Thoughts lingered longer. The absence of daylight softened urgency. Problems unfolded slowly, deliberately. In the quiet hours, the mind wanders. Sometimes it wanders toward memory. Other times, toward speculation. The engineer describes staring at monitors late at night, watching steady data streams, and feeling a sense of distance, not just from the outside world, but from himself. As if he were observing his own life the way he observed systems, dispassionately, patiently. This detachment was not unpleasant. It was neutral. Neutrality was prized here. Emotion, like curiosity, was something to be managed carefully. Strong reactions disrupted focus. Calm endurance was rewarded. Over time, emotional spikes flattened, much like the days themselves. This did not mean the engineer felt nothing. It meant he felt things quietly. There were moments of pride, though muted. Moments of frustration, quickly resolved. Moments of fatigue that sank deep into the body rather than the mind. Sleep, when it came, was heavy, uninterrupted, dreamless. And when he woke, the cycle resumed. Years passed this way. Not dramatically, not noticeably. They simply accumulated. The engineer recalls one particular realization, standing in a hallway he had walked through thousands of times, when he understood that he had spent more of his waking life under artificial light than natural. that his memories were lit not by sun or moon, but by fixtures designed never to flicker. The thought did not disturb him. It surprised him, because it meant something had happened quietly, without announcement. Time had moved, and yet it did not feel like loss. It felt like continuity. The range provided a stable environment in a changing world. While politics shifted and public discourse grew louder, the work remained steady. Night after night, systems were tested, problems solved, adjustments made. Outside, decades passed. Inside, it felt like an extended present. This is the paradox of repetition. It makes days feel short, but years disappear. The engineer's voice, in the recording, slows when he speaks of this period. His sentences lengthen. Pauses deepen, as if recalling these years requires him to stretch memory carefully, separating one night from another. He does not lament the passing of time. He observes it. He speaks of colleagues who retired suddenly, their absence noted only when their badges no longer appeared on schedules. Of new faces who arrived fully formed, already adapted to the rhythm. Of how continuity persisted even as individuals changed. The system absorbed people seamlessly, and perhaps that was the point. As the years faded together, something else began to happen. In the quiet, repetitive hours, with nothing pressing for resolution, the mind found room to wander. Not toward forbidden questions, but toward larger ones. Questions that did not threaten security or structure. Questions about scale, about distance, about what lies beyond the immediate horizon. And as years fade together, the mind begins to wander, sometimes beyond Earth itself. Rumors do not arrive loudly. They do not interrupt meetings or demand attention. They drift in quietly, carried on fragments of conversation, half-finished sentences, a look exchanged between colleagues that lingers a second too long. In places like this, rumors rarely announce themselves as stories. They arrive as absences, things not said, explanations that stop just short of clarity. The engineer noticed them early, though he learned not to acknowledge them. They existed at the edges of awareness, never central, never urgent. Someone mentioning a sighting without details. A casual reference to something unusual seen years ago. A joke told without a punchline. The kind of comments that fade if you don't reach for them. And most people didn't. Within closed systems, stories circulate differently. There are fewer entry points, fewer voices, fewer opportunities for contradiction. Information moves slowly, often sideways rather than forward. What matters is not accuracy, but persistence. A rumor only needs to survive, not be proven. In the Nevada desert, far from population centers, UFO folklore had already taken root long before the engineer arrived. Locals spoke of lights moving across the sky. Pilots shared stories of objects that didn't behave as expected. Travelers described moments of disorientation, of seeing something they couldn't explain and then quickly forgetting about it. These accounts existed in parallel to official narratives, rarely intersecting. They were not investigated seriously, nor were they dismissed entirely. They simply existed. Inside the range, the engineer encountered these stories indirectly, not as briefings or warnings, but as cultural background noise. A shared understanding that some things were discussed elsewhere, by people outside the system, in ways that bore little resemblance to daily reality. He did not feel threatened by these stories. He found them oddly predictable. Ambiguity thrives where information is scarce. Information vacuum theory suggests that when official explanations are absent or incomplete, people fill the gaps themselves. Not maliciously, creatively. Humans are not comfortable with empty spaces in narrative. They prefer even unlikely explanations to none at all. Area 51, with its deliberate silence, created the perfect vacuum. The engineer understood this intuitively. He did not view rumors as challenges to secrecy, but as natural byproducts of it. When you refuse to explain, others will try. When you remain silent, stories speak louder. In the late 1980s, this dynamic intensified. The 1989 Bob Lazar media wave brought Area 51 into public consciousness in a way it had never been before. Claims of reverse-engineered alien technology, underground facilities, and extraterrestrial materials captured widespread attention. Television segments aired. Newspapers speculated. Late-night conversations shifted tone. Inside the range, the response was muted. No emergency meetings. No clarifications. No visible reaction at all. The engineer remembers this period as strangely quiet, as if the system had anticipated it, as if rumors, once loud enough, were expected to burn themselves out. And to some extent, they did. Because without confirmation, even the most dramatic stories struggle to sustain momentum. They fragment. They evolve. They merge with other narratives. Over time, they become part of a broader mythology rather than a focused inquiry. The engineer did not watch these developments closely. He did not need to. His work remained unchanged. His routines continued. The machines behaved as they always had. What changed was the outside perception. Suddenly, a place that had once been obscure became symbolic. Area 51 transformed from a test site into a cultural placeholder, a location onto which people projected fears, hopes, and unanswered questions. Aliens became shorthand, not necessarily for belief in visitors from elsewhere, but for the idea that something important was being hidden, something beyond ordinary understanding, something that challenged official narratives. Inside, this shorthand felt distant. The engineer notes that rumors rarely penetrated operational spaces. They did not influence decisions or designs. They were not discussed seriously, but they were not forbidden either. They simply existed outside the frame. Occasionally, someone would reference a headline in passing, a comment made lightly, without intent. These moments were brief, often followed by silence. Not because of fear, but because there was nothing to add. Truth, in this environment, was rarely singular. It was fragmented, contextual, limited by design. To confirm or deny rumors would require stepping outside the system's logic, and that logic was deeply ingrained. The engineer reflects on how ambiguity became more powerful than truth. A confirmed fact has boundaries. It can be examined, debated, eventually resolved. Ambiguity, by contrast, expands endlessly. It invites interpretation. It adapts to new fears and new eras. Silence feeds this process effortlessly. Whistleblower culture complicated matters further. Over time, individuals emerged claiming insider knowledge, each with their own version of events. Some were sincere, some less so. Distinguishing between them required access to information most people did not have. The engineer did not judge these figures. He understood the impulse, a desire to be heard, to matter, to disrupt silence. But he also understood the limitations. In systems built on compartmentalization, no single individual sees enough to tell a complete story. What whistleblowers often reveal are fragments, real, imagined, or misinterpreted, woven into larger narratives by audiences eager for coherence. The engineer recognized this pattern. He saw how partial truths gained authority through repetition, how uncertainty hardened into belief. Yet he felt no urge to intervene, because from his perspective, these stories were not dangerous. They were distracting. They absorbed attention that might otherwise focus on more mundane realities. Budget allocations, technological trade-offs, strategic decisions. Aliens, as an idea, were expansive enough to hold curiosity without threatening operational security. The engineer once remarked, quietly, almost to himself, that if people were looking up at the sky, they were less likely to look closely at the ground. This was not cynicism. It was observation. Rumors entered the room not as intruders, but as echoes, reflections of a broader discomfort with not knowing. They spoke less about what was hidden and more about what people wanted explained. Inside the range, ambiguity was normal. Outside, it was intolerable. The engineer learned to live with this divide. He did not correct friends when they speculated. He did not argue with family members who mentioned things they had heard. He listened politely, then let the conversation move on. His silence was not an endorsement. It was alignment. Over time, rumors lost their sharpness. They became background texture, something always present, rarely examined closely. In the recording, when he speaks of this period, his tone remains even. He does not dramatize. He does not reveal. He does not dismiss. He simply notes that stories thrive where certainty is absent, and that certainty was never the goal here. The goal was function, and function required quiet. Rumors linger, but silence always returns, thicker, heavier, and more permanent. Silence, when practiced long enough, begins to leave an imprint. Not immediately, not in ways that are easy to notice. At first, it feels practical, protective, even. Words are filtered, details withheld, conversations redirected gently, almost automatically. Over time, these small adjustments accumulate, shaping not just speech, but thought itself. The engineer did not experience secrecy as tension. He experienced it as restraint. Occupational stress research often focuses on overload, too much information, too many demands, too many decisions. But in environments defined by classification, the pressure comes from the opposite direction, from narrowing, from the constant removal of context, from the discipline of holding back, again and again, until withholding becomes instinct. He learned early how to speak without saying anything. At family gatherings, when asked about work, his answers were brief and abstract. Same projects. Still technical. Nothing new. These responses were not rehearsed. They were reflexive. Over time, even he stopped noticing their vagueness. Family members adapted. Spouses learn when not to press. Children grow up understanding that some questions don't have answers. Conversations adjust their shape around a quiet center that remains untouched. This is how omission becomes normal. The engineer did not feel dishonest. He felt incomplete. Identity compartmentalization, splitting the self into functional roles, was encouraged subtly by the system. Work stayed at work. Home stayed separate. Emotions associated with one rarely crossed into the other. This separation was efficient. It allowed focus. It reduced risk. But it also thinned continuity. The engineer sometimes struggled to explain himself even when secrecy was not required. Years of filtering made expression feel imprecise. He would start a sentence, pause, and abandon it, not because the information was classified, but because the habit of stopping had become ingrained. Words felt heavy, inexact. Emotional restraint followed a similar pattern. Strong reactions were discouraged, not explicitly, but through environment. Calm was rewarded. Predictability valued. Over time, emotional expression flattened, not into numbness, but into moderation. Joy was quiet. Frustration internalized. Fear managed privately. Military family dynamics research notes that families connected to classified work often develop parallel silences. Loved ones sense boundaries without being told where they lie. They learn to live with partial presence, with someone who is physically there, but mentally elsewhere. The engineer's family described him as steady, reliable, distant in a way that was difficult to articulate. He was attentive, but reserved, loving, but measured. They could not have known how much of him remained unshared. The cost of never speaking is not sudden loss. It is gradual erosion. Memories reshape themselves when they cannot be discussed. Without retelling, details soften. Events lose emotional edges. Experiences flatten into impressions rather than stories. The engineer noticed this when trying to recall early moments in his career. He remembered how things felt, but not always why. He remembered pressure without context, pride without explanation, fatigue without narrative. Secrecy reshapes memory by isolating it. Long-term classified work effects include this subtle disintegration of personal history. Without social reinforcement, memories remain unexamined. They are not challenged, refined, or integrated into identity. They simply exist quietly. The engineer did not mourn this loss. He did not frame it as damage. He accepted it as trade-off. But in the recording, there is a shift. He speaks of moments when he realized he had no shared language for large parts of his life. That if he were asked to explain his career honestly, he would struggle, not because of restrictions, but because so much of it had never been externalized. His life had been lived inward. This inwardness had benefits. It fostered self-reliance, emotional regulation, a capacity for solitude. He was comfortable being alone with his thoughts, comfortable with long stretches of quiet. But it also narrowed his sense of connection. At times, he felt like an observer in his own life, watching relationships unfold without fully entering them, listening more than speaking, holding more than sharing. He does not blame the work. He does not blame the system. He observes. Secrecy did not demand silence. It rewarded it, and rewards shape behavior. In the recording, when he reflects on this cost, his tone remains even. There is no bitterness, only curiosity, as if he is examining a structure he helped inhabit, trying to understand its effects from a distance. He wonders aloud, not dramatically, whether things might have been different had he spoken more, shared more, allowed others into the unfinished parts of his experience. The question lingers, unanswered, because even now, speaking feels unfamiliar. And yet, this recording exists, which suggests something changed. Perhaps nearing the end, the engineer felt less compelled to protect boundaries that no longer served him. Or perhaps he simply wanted to hear his own voice articulate thoughts that had lived silently for too long. In that quiet erosion, the engineer begins to think less about secrets and more about meaning. The recording does not begin with an introduction. There is no date spoken aloud, no name offered, no attempt to frame what follows as important. What you hear first is ambient sound, subtle, almost imperceptible, a room tone, a breath, the faint suggestion of space. Then, after a pause long enough to feel intentional, the voice begins. It is older than you expect, not weak, but worn in a way that suggests long use rather than decline. The cadence is unhurried. Words arrive slowly, spaced by silences that are not filled or corrected. This is not a performance. It is not meant to persuade, instruct, or impress. It feels more like someone thinking out loud. Oral history practices often encourage structure, guiding questions, chronological markers, clarifying prompts. This recording has none of that. There is no interviewer, no narrative arc imposed from the outside. What emerges instead is something closer to a private reckoning, a final arrangement of thoughts spoken into the quiet, without expectation of response. The engineer does not say why he is recording. He does not say who might hear it. He simply speaks. At times, he stops mid-sentence, as if realizing that the words he intended to say no longer feel necessary. At other moments, he returns to ideas already mentioned, approaching them from slightly different angles. There is repetition, but not insistence. More like circling, testing whether something still holds when viewed again. The tone remains consistent throughout, measured, calm, reflective. There is no urgency here. If these are his last words, they are not shaped by fear of running out of time. They are shaped by familiarity with silence, with letting things sit, with allowing meaning to surface slowly, if at all. What stands out most is what he does not say. He does not name programs. He does not identify technologies. He does not confirm or deny the stories that surround the place he worked. He avoids specifics not because they are forbidden, but because they are no longer the point. This is not a confession. It is an acceptance. End-of-career testimonies often focus on legacy, on accomplishments, lessons learned, warnings offered. This recording resists that impulse. The engineer does not attempt to summarize his life's work. He does not seek to justify it. Instead, he reflects on experience itself, on the feeling of working for decades within systems that never fully revealed themselves, on the quiet satisfaction of solving problems that would never be discussed, on the odd peace that comes from knowing your contributions exist mostly in absence. There is a moment when his voice softens noticeably. He speaks about routine, not as monotony, but as grounding. How repetition made life manageable. How predictability allowed focus. How days passed without friction. He seems surprised by this realization, as if only now noticing how deeply structure shaped him. Then he pauses. The silence stretches. Archival audio preservation specialists often note that silence can be as informative as speech. In this recording, the pauses feel deliberate, but not planned. They are moments of recalibration, spaces where thought reorganizes itself before continuing. When he resumes, the subject has shifted slightly. He speaks of memory, not of events, but of impressions, of how certain sensations remain vivid. The hum of equipment, the quality of light at night, the feeling of standing alone outside after a test run, listening to the desert return to stillness. He admits that many details have faded. That dates blur. That names escape him. This does not trouble him. Instead, he wonders whether memory was ever meant to be precise, whether what remains is what mattered. He speaks about people briefly, colleagues whose faces he remembers, but whose names he does not, teams that formed and dissolved without ceremony, relationships defined more by shared silence than conversation. There is no sentimentality here, only recognition. At one point, he acknowledges that some may listen to this recording hoping for answers. He does not address them directly, but the implication is clear. If answers were his goal, he would have spoken differently. This recording is not meant to resolve anything. It is meant to settle something internal. Legacy documentation norms often emphasize clarity, ensuring future generations understand what was done and why. This recording resists that impulse entirely. It offers no clear lessons. no warnings, no instructions. What it offers instead is tone. The tone of someone who has made peace with incompleteness. The engineer reflects on secrecy again, but this time without analysis. He does not speak of structures or doctrines. He speaks of living within boundaries long enough that they become invisible. He admits that he rarely questioned this while it was happening. That questioning felt unnecessary, even indulgent. The system worked. The work mattered. That was enough. Only later did he begin to wonder about the personal cost. Even then, the wondering remains gentle. There is no regret in his voice. No sense that something was stolen from him. Only the awareness that choices, even necessary ones, shape us in ways we do not fully see until much later. He mentions the desert again. How it never changed, even as everything else did. How it provided a kind of continuity when projects ended and people left. How standing under the night sky made individual concerns feel smaller, less urgent. The desert, in his telling, is not mysterious. It is patient. And patience, he suggests, may be the most enduring form of secrecy. Toward the end of the recording, his speech slows further. Words come less frequently. Pauses lengthen. It becomes harder to tell whether he is speaking to someone imagined or simply listening to his own thoughts take shape. There is a sense that he is reaching the end, not because he announces it, but because the energy of reflection has softened into stillness. He does not conclude. He does not say goodbye. The recording simply ends. No click. No final breath captured. Just silence. Those who have listened to it describe an unusual feeling afterward. Not shock. Not disappointment. But calm. As if they had been allowed to sit quietly with someone else's interior world for a moment, without obligation to understand it. In this way, the recording functions less as documentation and more as atmosphere. A space to inhabit briefly. A reminder that not all stories are meant to be finished. The engineer never intended these words to be definitive. They are not evidence. They are not revelation. They are presence. And as the voice softens, it turns outward, toward the desert, the night, and time itself. Silence, in this story, is not an accident. It is not the result of missing files, lost recordings, or forgotten explanations. It is not a gap waiting to be filled. It is a shape, intentional, structured, and carefully maintained. The engineer understood this long before he had words for it. In the systems he worked within, silence was not simply the absence of sound or speech. It was an outcome, something planned for, preserved, and protected with the same care as any physical asset. Silence was not what remained when information was removed. Silence was what replaced it. Information control theory describes this not as suppression, but as modulation. The idea is not to eliminate information entirely, but to regulate its flow so precisely that what remains communicates more than what is revealed. A statement can be argued with. Silence cannot. Silence does not invite rebuttal. It invites projection. Over the years, the engineer watched this dynamic play out repeatedly. A question would surface in public discourse. A rumor would gain traction. Curiosity would peak. And then, nothing. No confirmation. No denial. No clarification. Just quiet. To an outside observer, this quiet often felt evasive, suspicious, provocative, but from within the system, it felt stabilizing. Strategic ambiguity, as it is sometimes called, allows multiple interpretations to coexist without committing to any of them. It keeps options open. It reduces risk. By saying nothing, the system avoided being pinned down. The engineer did not experience this as manipulation. He experienced it as containment. Psychological containment is the practice of holding uncertainty without allowing it to escalate into anxiety or action. In secure environments, this principle extends outward. By refusing to resolve ambiguity publicly, institutions prevent narratives from solidifying into demands. Silence diffuses pressure. Over time, the absence of information becomes its own message. Not a specific one, but a general signal. This is not for you. Not now. Perhaps not ever. The engineer noticed how quickly people adapted to this signal. How initial frustration gave way to speculation, then to resignation, then to myth. Silence did not end curiosity. It redirected it inward, where it could wander safely without consequence. And wandering, when unchallenged, eventually slows. Inside the range, silence functioned differently. It was not dramatic or symbolic. It was practical. Meetings ended without summaries. Projects concluded without announcements. Achievements were noted internally, then allowed to dissolve. There was no expectation that work would be explained or celebrated beyond its immediate context. Silence was simply how things ended. This had a calming effect. Without constant explanation, the mind stopped reaching outward for validation. Without public narrative, work existed purely as process. There was no audience to impress, no legacy to manage. The engineer describes this as freeing. It allowed focus without self-consciousness. Decisions were made based on necessity, not optics. Mistakes were addressed quietly. Successes absorbed without fanfare. Silence, in this sense, removed pressure. Government communication silence often frustrates those outside the system, but within it, the lack of noise creates space. Space to think. Space to act. Space to let things settle. The engineer learned to trust this settling. When asked, years later, whether it bothered him that so much of his work would never be acknowledged, he paused. Then he answered simply, acknowledgement was never part of the design. Design, in his world, was about outcomes, not stories. Silence ensured continuity. It prevented escalation. It allowed time to do its quiet work of softening edges and dissolving urgency. This is why, in the recording, the engineer does not rush to fill gaps. He allows pauses to stretch. He lets sentences trail off. He resists the instinct to explain. He understands that silence does not need justification. For the listener, this can feel unfamiliar. Modern life is loud. Explanations are constant. Notifications demand attention. Questions are answered instantly, even when answers are incomplete or unreliable. Silence, by contrast, feels uncomfortable at first. But if allowed to remain, it becomes something else. The engineer seems aware of this. His voice, steady and unhurried, invites the listener not to solve anything, not to decode hidden meanings, not to search for revelation between the lines. Instead, he invites stillness, rest in not knowing. This is not resignation. It is acceptance. There is a difference between ignorance and openness. Ignorance resists understanding. Openness allows uncertainty to exist without urgency. The engineer's silence belongs to the latter. He does not deny that curiosity is natural. He does not suggest that questions are wrong. He simply acknowledges that not all questions require answers, and that some answers, when forced, do more harm than good. In the architecture of secrecy, silence functions as a boundary that protects not just information, but the people who hold it. It shields them from the constant demand to justify their existence, their choices, their work. Over time, this shielding becomes internalized. The engineer no longer feels compelled to explain himself, even to himself. He trusts that what mattered was done, that what remains unfinished can be left that way. This trust is quiet, and quiet, once embraced, becomes self-sustaining. As the recording continues, the engineer's pauses lengthen. His voice lowers slightly. There is a sense that he is not guiding the listener anywhere specific. He is simply allowing space to open. Space without expectation. In that space, curiosity softens. It does not disappear, but it loses its sharpness. Questions drift without demanding resolution. Thoughts slow. Silence reveals itself not as emptiness, but as depth. And within that depth, broader questions gently surface, about humanity, curiosity, and limits. There is a moment, late at night, when the world feels unfinished. The edges of things soften, shadows deepen, sounds travel farther than they should. And in that quiet suspension between wakefulness and sleep, the mind begins to notice how much of reality depends on light, on clarity, on definition. When the light recedes, imagination steps forward. The engineer understood this instinctively. He had spent years working in environments where darkness was not merely the absence of illumination, but a condition, sometimes intentional, sometimes unavoidable. He knew how quickly the mind fills what it cannot see, how effortlessly uncertainty becomes story. Human beings have always done this. Long before aircraft crossed the sky or satellites traced silent paths overhead, people looked into the dark and imagined presence. Watchers, guides, threats, visitors. The unknown has never remained empty for long. Jungian archetypes describe these recurring figures not as external truths, but as internal patterns, symbols that surface when consciousness encounters its limits. The watcher in the sky, the hidden intelligence, the idea that something else is out there, observing quietly. These ideas do not arrive randomly. They emerge when cultures are under strain. In the decades following World War II, American society entered a period of deep contradiction. Technological optimism grew alongside existential fear. Nuclear power promised both limitless energy and total destruction. Science advanced faster than ethics could follow. The future felt expansive and fragile. Post-war American anxiety did not always express itself openly. It hid in entertainment, in art, in speculation. And eventually, it looked up. The sky, once a symbol of freedom, became a space of surveillance. Aircraft flew higher. Missiles traveled farther. What had once been distant now felt close. Immediate. Personal. In this context, UFOs became more than unidentified objects. They became containers. Collective projection theory suggests that societies externalize their unresolved tensions by assigning them to imagined others. When fears cannot be named directly, they are relocated, often upward, outward, into the unknown. Aliens, in this sense, are not answers. They are mirrors. They reflect anxieties about powerlessness, about being watched without consent, about technology advancing beyond human control, about knowledge being withheld by unseen authorities. The engineer never spoke of this explicitly, but in his pauses, in the way he allowed silence to sit, there was an acknowledgement of this dynamic. He did not dismiss belief. He did not endorse it either. He understood that belief often has less to do with evidence and more to do with need. In the desert, at night, under a sky untouched by city light, it is easy to feel small, to sense scale in a way that humbles certainty. The stars do not explain themselves. They do not reassure. They simply exist. For some, this vastness is comforting. For others, it is unsettling. When faced with immensity, the mind seeks structure. It asks, who else is here? Who might be watching? Who knows more than we do? These questions are ancient. They predate technology. But modern secrecy gives them new shape. Cultural myth-making thrives where official narratives stop short. When institutions remain silent, imagination becomes authoritative. Stories gain weight through repetition rather than verification. Over time, they feel less like speculation and more like inherited knowledge. The engineer observed this from a distance. He noticed how people spoke about Area 51 not as a place, but as an idea, a symbol of withheld truth, a focal point for collective unease. The specifics mattered less than the implication that something important was being hidden. Whether that something was alien or terrestrial became almost irrelevant. What mattered was the feeling of exclusion, of not being trusted with the full picture, of sensing that decisions were being made elsewhere, by others, beyond visibility. UFOs provided a language for this feeling. They allowed people to express distrust without naming institutions, to imagine intelligence without confronting authority, to assign mystery to the sky rather than to systems on the ground. In this way, belief became soothing. It offered distance. If the unknown was out there, far away, then perhaps it was not embedded within everyday life. Perhaps it did not require action. Perhaps it could remain a curiosity rather than a responsibility. The engineer seemed to recognize this comfort. He did not resent the stories. He did not feel threatened by them. He saw them as natural expressions of a society grappling with limits of knowledge, of control, of transparency. He had lived inside those limits long enough to see their contours clearly. In the recording, when he speaks about belief, his tone remains neutral. He does not analyze. He observes. He notes how often people look upward when searching for meaning, and how rarely they look inward. This is not criticism. It is reflection. The dark, after all, invites projection because it refuses definition. It offers no answers, only space. And space can be unsettling or liberating, depending on what one brings to it. The engineer brought patience. He had learned that not all unknowns are meant to be resolved, that some questions persist because they serve a purpose. They keep the mind engaged without demanding closure. They allow wonder without conclusion. In this sense, UFOs and hidden truths function as modern myths, not lies, but stories that hold emotional truth even when factual certainty is absent. They speak to a desire for connection beyond the visible world, to reassurance that humanity is not alone in its confusion, to the hope that someone, somewhere, understands the systems we cannot. The engineer did not share this hope, nor did he reject it. He allowed it to exist, perhaps because he knew that certainty, once achieved, often disappoints, that answers close doors as much as they open them. That mystery, when held gently, can be calming rather than distressing. As the night deepens, questions naturally slow. Curiosity softens into contemplation. The mind stops demanding explanation and begins to accept presence. Eventually, even these questions slow, stretching into something quieter and deeper. When the voices fade, the desert remains. Long after shifts end and badges are returned, after schedules dissolve and programs conclude, the land continues in its quiet persistence. It does not mark endings. It does not record achievements. It simply holds what was placed upon it, then slowly, patiently, reclaims what it can. The Nevada desert has witnessed many departures. Runways once busy with experimental flights now sit empty, their surfaces bleached by sun and wind. Painted markings soften, edges blur. Cracks appear where heat and cold take turns testing the ground. What once felt precise begins to loosen, returning to something more natural. Dormant hangars stand still against the horizon, their doors closed, their interiors dark. Inside, echoes linger briefly, then settle. Dust gathers in corners where machinery once hummed. The air smells faintly of metal and dryness, a reminder of activity that no longer needs to announce itself. At night, the lights are fewer. Some still glow, small, distant points that suggest continued presence, but many have gone dark. Poles remain, but bulbs burn out and are not replaced. The darkness thickens gradually, reclaiming the space between structures. From far away, it becomes difficult to tell where the facility ends and the desert begins. This is how places outlast stories. Abandoned military infrastructure does not collapse dramatically. It endures quietly. Buildings remain standing long after their purpose fades. Roads persist, even when they lead nowhere. Fences rust slowly, their warnings becoming less urgent with each passing year. The desert accommodates all of it. Wind moves freely through open spaces, carrying sand across concrete and asphalt. Small plants take hold in cracks, testing boundaries. Insects return. Birds perch where they once avoided. Life reasserts itself not aggressively, but steadily. Environmental persistence is not about erasure. It is about integration. What was built here does not vanish. It becomes part of the landscape's long memory. Structures age into landmarks. Disturbances settle into patterns. The land absorbs human intention without judgment. Long-term land use studies show that even heavily modified environments eventually stabilize. Not back to what they were before, but into something new. A layered terrain where past and present coexist quietly. The engineer understood this. In his reflections, he speaks of returning to familiar places near the end of his career. Standing outside facilities he once entered daily. Noticing how little they seemed to need him now. How the work continued, or didn't, without his presence. There was no sense of loss in this realization. Only perspective. Places do not remember people the way people remember places. They hold impressions, not identities. Footprints fade. Names disappear. What remains is structure, softened by time. The desert excels at this softening. Nevada desert ecology is resilient precisely because it moves slowly. Changes occur over decades, not days. Recovery is patient. Balance is gradual. Nothing rushes. This pace creates a kind of reassurance. No matter how intense human activity becomes, it is temporary here. Even the most secretive operations, the most guarded sites, eventually yield to weather, to distance, to quiet neglect. The desert waits them out. As night settles fully, the temperature drops. Air cools against the skin. Sounds carry farther, then disappear. The sky deepens, stars emerging one by one, unbothered by what unfolded beneath them. Looking up, it becomes clear how small all of this is. The runways, the hangars, the stories, the rumors, the secrets. They occupy a narrow slice of time. The land stretches far beyond that slice, both backward and forward. It remembers ancient lakes and forgotten migrations. It will witness futures no one here will see. This perspective does not diminish what happened. It contextualizes it. The engineer seemed comforted by this thought. That whatever he contributed, whatever he withheld, whatever he never spoke aloud, would eventually dissolve into something larger and quieter than personal legacy. He did not seek permanence. Perhaps that is why his final reflections feel so calm. Standing alone at night, with the desert breathing slowly around him, there was nothing left to defend, nothing left to hide. The land did not ask for explanations. It simply existed. For the listener, this return to the desert is not an ending in the usual sense. There are no conclusions to draw, no final truths to extract, only a settling, a reminder that places endure without needing to be understood, that stories fade, but space remains, that secrecy, like all human constructs, is temporary, while silence, in the desert, is constant. As the lights dim and the horizon dissolves into darkness, the environment prepares itself for rest. Wind slows. Temperatures even out. The ground releases the last of the day's warmth. Nothing waits to be uncovered now. Nothing calls for attention. And with nothing left to uncover, the night gently closes in. Now, there is nothing left to explain. No final detail waiting to be revealed. No answer hidden just beyond reach. No truth that requires effort to uncover. Only quiet. The kind of quiet that does not feel empty, but complete. If questions remain, and they often do, you don't need to carry them any further tonight.